make South Africa's steel great again. You could say that's what our government's trying to do, amidst fears ArcelorMittal's 2 SA long steel plants are now facing possible closure. 3,500 jobs are currently at stake, so government is now considering hiking steel import tariffs. That's similar to the Trump administration's policy, all to protect local steelmakers. It could be critical to saving our manufacturing sector and economy, which is struggling to realize hopes of 2% annual growth. We've called in our journalist on this beat, Lisa Steyn, to explain the intricacies.
The steel industry's growth is intricately tied with economic growth. The intervention needs to be there. There needs to be policy in place that's going to stimulate demand for steel, or at the very least stimulate economic demand, which in turn will stimulate demand for steel.
And later in the show, Trump's tip for SA ambassador was always a shoe-in, and global superstars are bringing the magic to Mzansi in 2025. To stay tuned to The Lead for every edition, please hit the follow button on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. My name's Graham Robenheimer. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. Global steel supply is good, almost too good, and demand's not keeping up. So cheap steel imports are flooding our market. It's lighting a fire under the state and private sector to act or suffer the long-term economic consequences. Well, joining us to chat more from our Johannesburg studios is our specialist journalist and writer-at-large, Lisa Steyn. Lisa, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm well, thanks.
Yeah, lekker. Big stories on your agenda for today?
Not really. Been out and about looking at some small relics in Joburg town and just preparing for our chat now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know that this is a fairly complex story to try and get into. Let's start with the latest regarding ArcelorMittal. There's 2 steel mills, or long steel mills, if you will. They're based in Vereniging and Newcastle, towns that would obviously rely heavily on this sort of industry for their livelihoods. But they're currently facing sort of a possible closure, and there's 3,500 jobs here essentially on the line. There's been a lot of intense speculation about government's involvement in keeping them open. There's this entity called the Industrial Development Corporation, and that could bring some financing into the equation by buying out a majority stake in AMSA. That's one of the possibilities here. But let's start here. How critical are these 2 steel mills to our very sluggish economy at the moment? What do they offer, and how do they assist any accompanying industries?
All right. Well, yeah, I suppose that the big point is the 3,500 jobs that they support. A lot of that's concentrated around Newcastle, which is the industrial hub of KZN. So regionally, that mill is really critical. And it's producing long steel, which is basic things that you use in construction, like rebar. A lot of other things, like you'd use it in expanding transmission lines, which is something that we have ambitions to do. So the question is, where will it come from in future? And of course, there are, Vereniging in particular, has more specialized long steel. So that feeds into the automotive industry. So the automakers are quite nervous about where they're going to get that alternative supply.
In the meantime, there is obviously the fear that there's a lot of cheap Chinese imports sort of like flooding into the market. Of course, macroeconomically, the discussion has been about this dumping of steel for the longest time. But that's not been the only issue at stake here when it comes to local manufacturing coming under strain with this discussion. Obviously, Eskom's power cuts and several other factors have come into the equation, right?
Yes. So the low-cost imports are a bigger issue on the flat steel side. And yes, of course, higher power prices are a huge problem for industry in general, and energy-intensive industry like steelmaking, definitely. And then higher railing costs, another big issue, keeping in mind that Newcastle is located quite far away from the iron ore mines in the Northern Cape. So that's another thing that really hits them hard.
What's government's role here? As we've heard from Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Parks Tau, they obviously want to try and save the 3,500 jobs. If they can't find a way, that would be an indictment on the GNU at the moment. So what's your feeling, your gut instinct, your journalism spidey sense as to the IDC's role here with ArcelorMittal. Do you think that that's a deal worth making?
So we know definitely there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes. The minister was hoping to announce a deal today, in fact, and we'll see pretty soon if that happens or not. But it's imminent that that something is either accepted or rejected, I suppose. And the IDC is a state-owned development financier. It will almost certainly be involved in any sort of funding solution. It does already have big exposure to the steel industry. And so one sort of wonders what the cap is there, without fixing some of the bigger issues around policy and things that are impacting growth and hurting steel demand. It's a fair assumption that this won't be the last time that these mills are going to need some financial support.
Government's now essentially going to review all its tariff policies regarding steel imports. Of course, we know earlier this month, Trump had announced his own for the US, a massive 25% tariff on all steel and aluminium imports in response to what China's doing. But here, this would be, if we had to take a similar approach, it would be quite unprecedented in the sense because we're also forcing the mining sector and other parts of the economy to play ball in certain ways as well. Explain some of those sort of tariff review policies that government's sort of like playing with at the moment.
Right. So I think the broader context is that panic seems to really be setting in over the state of the steel industry, and that is in light of a slump in the construction sector in China, which means there's a lot of excess steel floating around the globe coming into our market at very cheap prices. And then, of course, we're seeing drastic moves by Trump. And there's a bit of a concern that that sort of inspired the International Trade Administration Commission in this review, which is going to look at 606 tariff codes for steel, which is enormous. It's unprecedented in size for them. And it's going to consider a few measures. I mean, whether it will decide to take these moves, obviously we don't know. But they do want to investigate things like potentially pushing rates up to the maximum that the World Trade Organization allowed. And they want to look at even ways that they can surpass that, which some trade experts are worried would be illegal. So they're specifically talking about certain measures, and the one is how they can exceed these limits. There are provisions to exceed them, but the trade experts don't think that the circumstances qualify. So there's a bit of concern of how government is going to approach it, just given the context of what we're seeing happening in the US and how other people are treating the World Trade Organization at the moment.
Which is interesting because if you had to look at theories around global political economy, if one big superpower like the US tends to sort of cloister up and say, we're going to start putting more heavier tariffs on imports coming in, there's a theory that it forces every other country to do the same. And so here, potentially in South Africa, this is what may manifest, which I find very, very interesting. So there's also this talk within the mining sector to reduce input costs for steel makers. That's also something that hasn't really been done before, right?
Yeah, so it's really stretching beyond the normal parameters of the supply chain, where they want to look at iron ore producers and coke and coal producers. Those are inputs for steel making, and see if they can force discounts. It's something they're going to investigate.
Yeah, and then the International Trade Administration Commission of SA, it's tasked with implementing any of these possible policies going ahead. What's the time span here in your mind? This is obviously we're chartering into different waters, so it could be a really long time, or there's fears that it could be done overnight.
Yeah, so I mean, it is, as we've been saying, it's a huge review. It's touches on 606 tariff codes. It impacts some 67 billion in imports. Trade experts have sort of pointed out that ITAC, on average, takes about 27 months to do a tariff code review, with some currently stretching into 5 years. And of course, this is now unprecedented in scale. So it just seems like it's going to take a very long time. But we do know that there's pressure from the minister. He wants feedback as early as July this year, although what exactly form that feedback might take, we don't know. But of course, there's now concern that, this thing could have unintended consequences anyway. there's going to be winners and losers. There will be collateral damage. And if you rush it, that could be, infinitely worse.
Sure. Lisa, some are saying, in terms of the smaller steel mill sector, that, whatever happens to AMSA, the government should, in the meantime, return or reinstate this ban on exports of scrap metal, specifically. I thought that was quite interesting. Why is that being called?
So these are they call them mini mills, although if you see them, they're far from mini. They are also supported in funding by the IDC, and there's currently policy in place that gives them already cheap access to cheap scrap metal. So what's happening is they are already producing long steel at very competitive rates. In fact, rates that are so competitive that AMSA can't keep up, and that is really why, a key reason why Vereeniging and Newcastle need to close down or uncommercial currently. So they're saying, look, if that capacity goes, they can fill the gap like they already kind of are doing. They just need a ban on scrap exports, because that will help them fill the gap.
Economists at the moment, and perhaps my final question, are saying, there's a real push for South Africa to reach 2% sort of GDP growth annually, right? And we've been struggling, of course, since the state capture years to ever reach that point again. And that's been sort of something that we've been eyeing for the longest time. We might put it on paper at every sort of budget, but whether or not we actually achieve that a year from then is, remains to be seen. If we don't sort this steel sector issue out, that kind of throws the 2% out, right? What's your view?
It's sort of a chicken and egg kind of situation, because the steel industry's growth is intricately tied with economic growth. And that's really what people have been saying is the intervention needs to be there. There needs to be policy in place that's going to stimulate demand for steel, or at the very least stimulate economic demand, which in turn will stimulate demand for steel. And really that's something that's not really being addressed in all of this. And so the sector will probably remain in big trouble.
And actually, this is my final question. When we talk about mining and the economy in general, for the longest time, you get naysayers that say, well, South Africa was the biggest exporter of gold back in the day. I mean, we're talking, late 1800s to early 1900s. But mining is just not where it used to be anymore. And, whether or not that's a big contributor to our economy, there's always this sort of negative commentary around the sector. Your view, is there a lot of positivity other than what we're seeing in the steel sector at the moment?
I would say that there's there has been a change in sentiment with the governments of national unity. People are hopeful. The indicators are better than they have been before. But there's been a lot of damage, and there's a lot of intervention that's needed. Just not policy certainty, policy direction, taking a firm stand where there will be winners and losers, but people really are crying out for that. And yeah, it isn't forthcoming. So people are still quite negative, and of course, the potential closure of these steel mills is really causing a great amount of consternation and despair. Mining is no longer the backbone of the economy. It's the flywheel of the economy, as the Minerals Council likes to say. Financial services, retail, those have grown. Industry has not. And you can just look at the Eskom power price chart to explain a lot of that, to be honest. But policy malaise, definitely a major issue.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Lead. Appreciate you sort of putting it in simple terms for us. Have a fantastic day. To our trending topic now, and I'd like to think we called it here on The Lead. It's a done deal. Brent Bozell III is officially the US ambassador to South Africa. The conservative media man, US President Donald Trump, claims has, quote-unquote, exposed fake news hypocrites for many years. Trump also believes the new American diplomat in Pretoria brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to, quote, a nation that desperately needs it. Hailing from the state of Virginia, the ambassador's son was notably pardoned by the Trump administration recently after being imprisoned for storming Capitol Hill back in 2021. Here at home, the Freedom Front Plus party wants to be first in line to hold an audience with Boesel III. The EFF, though, calls the ambassador's appointment, quote, a calculated act of aggression, and that it shows Trump has no real intention of mending SA-US ties. Meanwhile, both the DA and International Relations Ministry refused to comment on Boesel III's initial nomination, and there's still no official word on who'll represent Pretoria and Washington next. But for credible updates, keep it here on The Lead. And finally, from 2 hours of Sting's 22-song set at Grand West Casino this week, by the way, at least a dozen were the police hits, to the Goo Goo Dolls finally going on tour here, Mzansi's being treated to a myriad of magical musical acts as of late. The Iris hitmakers say Cape Town reminds them of San Francisco, whilst 73-year-old Stings vowed to return one day. Meanwhile, Grammy Award-winning saxophonist legend Kenny G is heading to Cape Town, Pretoria and Durban in October. The jazzy instrumentalist told News 24 that his 4-decade career has been an amazing blessing of finally realizing a little boy's dream to simply play the saxophone every day. At the same time, Travis Scott is also bringing his rap tour Circus Maximus to the F&B Stadium in October. And about 2 months before they arrive, American pop star Doja Cat will hit the capital to perform at the Hey Neighbor Fest in August. And if, like myself, you didn't know this, the Grammy Award winners got South African heritage in father and actor Dumisani Dlamini. So, wherever you look, Mzansi's dominating the music space. Just keep checking News 24's arts and entertainment section for dates and ticket prices.
Burnt out from the week that was, but need to stay in the news loop?
Every Saturday morning at 6, we release The Weekender, a quirky, in-depth look at South Africa and its people.
Chock full of exclusive interviews, food, wine, playlists and opinions.
The Weekender is the ultimate segue into Saturday.
Right here on News 24.
From steel sector uncertainties to our amazing music scene. That's been our show and we want your feedback. Mail your comments and voice notes to thelead@24.com. That's to be included in our next edition. Be sure to subscribe to our show on Spotify and Apple by simply clicking the follow button. Daily episodes drop on News 24, Spotify and Apple Monday to Thursday at 7 at night. My name's Graham Robenheimer and so long as there's news, we'll have the lead.